Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome on the show helicopter pilot and the founder of Helicopters Without Borders, Owen McCLung-Sitnam. Now, in this conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from his journey into aviation, fighting wildland fires, EMS, responding to underserved Indigenous populations, some notable rescues, moral injury, positive tribalism, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of over 1,200 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I introduce to you Owen McCLung-Sitnam. Enjoy. Well, Owen, I want to start by saying two things. Firstly, thank you to our mutual friend, Dave Prashera-Best, for making this introduction. And secondly, I want to welcome you onto the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, James. Excited to be here.
So where on planet Earth are we finding you this afternoon?
So I've been born and raised in British Columbia. Here, I have the pleasure sitting on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish families, otherwise known as Vancouver. I grew up over on a little island off the coast called Bowen Island, and been living here for the last few years. But prior to that, I was up in northern parts of Canada and all around Canada where my work took me. Yeah.
Well, let's start at the very beginning of your timeline then. Tell me where you were born and tell me a little bit about your family dynamic, what your parents did, how many siblings?
Yeah, sure. So I was born over in North Vancouver, here in British Columbia. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with Canada. I know you're down in the States though, I believe.
Yeah, somewhat. I'm more so on the East Coast. I went to Montreal and Toronto, but I haven't been on the West Coast.
Yeah, right on. And then we moved over. When I was 4 years old. I had two incredible parents, Danny and Laura, otherwise known as Dad and Mom. And we moved over to Bowen Island, which is a little community of about 3,000 people when I was a youngster, and grew up in this really tight-knit community over there. You know everyone's face. I'm not great with names, but you definitely know everyone's face around the island. You kind of grow up in this extended family there. Dad was my inspiration to get into aviation. When he was my age, Dad was a bush pilot, a helicopter pilot, and kind of had a very similar career to my start too, was fighting fires up and down the coast as well as the inland and northern parts of Canada. And Mom, she had a big job of taking care of me and my sister, Cora Rose, when we were kids growing up. So my sister Cora, she's 2 years older than me. She's also in the charity sector. She does major gift fundraising for Children's Hospital here in the Lower Mainland. And yeah, that's a little small background on my upbringing there, James. Yeah.
What is your ethnic heritage? Because McClung sounds very Scottish to me, but then Sitnam reminds me of Thailand. So it's a very interesting last name you've got.
Yeah, no, I think have some heritage from all over the place, it seems like. So, mom's side, Irish and Scottish, and mom's American herself and Canadian now. On my father's side there, from Trinidad and Italy. So I got a kind of the best of East and West there. Yeah.
What was it that sent your father into the world of piloting in the first place?
My dad has a great story when he was young. He was working as a chef at the very first Keg, which is a steakhouse now, a big steakhouse chain in Canada. And he was working as a chef there when he was 18, 19, and a fellow came in with a helicopter and landed in the backyard. And he his clients didn't show up, so he asked my dad if he wanted to go for a rip. And my dad said yeah, and the way that my dad explains it, he never looked back after that. He became a helicopter pilot and started his journey there. And so dad runs a company, HeliJet International, here in Vancouver. And he's just always been around, taking me out to the helicopter since I was a little kid and seeing the organization. And, going through high school there, I was a little bit of a punk and I was having a hard time finishing high school, and all my friends were signing up for university. And I kind of just skimmed past grade 12 there. And I was in no need or desire to go to university, just because I just kind of struggled a bit through high school. And, Dad said, you always loved helicopters. He goes, what about going to get your helicopter license? Mom and Dad gave me a loan to go and do that. I went out, and same thing with me. I just fell in love with it. And I never looked back. And then I ended up getting my commercial license, moving up to Northern Canada and starting to build my hours.
Obviously, we're going to get to your time, in the helicopter, but what are some of the most epic stories of your father's career that you've heard, from that timeline?
Well, maybe some of them I can't share, James, publicly. Some of Dad's good stories that he had. I always remember one story that he told me. He was fueling up a helicopter, I think up near Squamish, near Whistler. And it was right on I believe he was in his old Gazelle. And he was fueling up a helicopter on the side of the road near this train track. And he had the helicopter on one side of the train track and the fuel cache on the other side. So if you can kind of get an idea of where the story is going, he had the hose lined up over to his helicopter. And he heard some horns blowing down the ways, and next thing he knew, the train was coming, and he still had the hose over the railroad track. And I think just in the nick of time, he was able to run back from the helicopter and get the hose past there before my existence expired and his as well, I guess. Yeah.
We have these, I've never actually used them in real life, but these blocks that are supposed to allow you to drive over a fire hose without breaking it. And I remember early in my career, I saw this picture, and I don't know who was behind it, but they had a hose line over a railroad track, and they'd put those blocks on the tracks like the train was just going to be able to jump over them. So that's the visual I get when you tell me that story.
I'll need to pass that on to them for next time for sure.
But what about sports and exercise? What were you playing and doing when you were a young boy through the school ages?
I loved baseball, James. I always played baseball as a youngster. Growing up on Bowen Island, that small community I was telling you about, that was our go-to. I think a lot of city folks, you have a lot more options of what to do as a kid. But for me and the young homies, we would drift down to the baseball park. And, our team, I always remember our team was number one every single year when we were young, all the way until we were teenagers. And finally, the districts, because Bowen Island, we had our own team and we always played the city teams there. And they ended up splitting up our Bowen League just because we were dominating every single year, and they mixed us in with the city teams. But yeah, I always loved baseball, man. I still play in a beer league over on Bowen Island, still with some mates as well, whatever games I can make over in the season. And then I played a bit of rugby. Once I got into high school, I enjoyed rugby, played second row. I've never been the most athletic individual. I was kind of always that average player, but I always loved doing it. And now, yeah, so as I said, baseball is probably the only team sport I do. And that, I like to bike ride with Dad, go to the gym, do a class. That's kind of it, yeah.
You mentioned about feeling a little wayward in high school. Was there anything on your mind as far as career aspirations then, or were you completely kind of clueless at that point?
I was probably pretty clueless, James, until I figured out I wasn't going to become a professional baseball player. That was not going to pan out as I hoped. I was probably in grade 11 or 12. I started to think more so in aviation, having that chat with my dad that I'd maybe go down that route. I always loved teaching though. I wasn't teaching at that point, but I loved aspect, and I got along well with some of my teachers, specifically Mr. Holmes, my woodworking teacher, and I thought maybe that would be a career path for me, maybe becoming a teacher down the line. And that was probably the only thing that I kind of thought about as a youngster, maybe going that way. Yeah.
What about during your earlier life? Did you have any exposure or understanding of some of these underserved communities that didn't have the resources that a city, for example, has the luxury of?
Honestly, James, no, I didn't know. Wasn't educated on it. For here in Canada, reconciliation it's not a new thing, but it's becoming more and more a realization of what's happening in some of our communities and what's happening in some of our population and how life is in our backyard. So for me, it wasn't until really getting into helicopters outboards when I started to see firsthand that fire started to grow more and more that, this is something that I want to do, that more community and social based work. But not so much when I was younger, no.
What about the entry to the world of piloting? You have your father, obviously he's a great pilot. He's taken you under his wing. What was your aptitude at the beginning? Did you take to it pretty well, or were you struggling?
So I struggled through high school, but it was kind of neat to see. I think for anyone, when you find something that you're kind of passionate about and you enjoy, my marks in aviation school were the best marks that I'd ever seen through all elementary and high school there. So it kind of just clicked for me, aviation piloting. I enjoyed it. I loved working with my hands and feet. The one class that I did enjoy in high school was mathematics and physics. I'm not saying I was a connoisseur or great at those, but I always did enjoy going to those classes. And then within aviation, it's pretty basic math and physics that you got to know in there. But either way, it was something that I was enjoying there. Putting the puzzle pieces together. And furthermore, when I started to upgrade my licenses and get into the IFR, which is instrument flight rules, so more so your head's inside the cockpit than outside to navigate. And that's where I really started to enjoy it too, because, you might be flying in the clouds and you're turning dials and punching out frequencies and discussing with your co-pilot there, pulling levers, pressing handles, and then all of a sudden you pop out and you're 200 feet above a runway and you're like, whoa, the system works. And I love that. It kind of felt like a little bit of a game of chess just to get there.
So which role did you find yourself first in when you actually got your license?
So when I first got my license, I went on a road trip up to Northern Canada. A lot of drivers, pilots in their beginning parts of their careers will go up in Canada into more of the bush work and get that VFR experience, which is the visual flight rules. And that's what I did. So, I traveled for about a year trying to even just find a placement with a company up in the north. I got on with a company called Vancouver Island Helicopters at the time. Really great experience. I wasn't flying, but, more just taking out the garbages and shoveling snow and trying to just prove myself to them for more of a character reference. And I got good experience working around helicopters, fueling up the helicopters in some mines that I was up near the Panhandle of Alaska, Glore Creek. But it was probably going to be, they told me, and they were transparent. They said, it's probably going to be about 5 years until you actually can get in the cockpit. So I started looking around, and then I got referred to another company called Remote Helicopters in northern Alberta. And they had just previously laid off a pilot and they needed a new pilot to do a pipeline patrol. So it was just really right place, right time, James, because I think the stat when I was going through school, I remember hearing it was like 5 to 10% of helicopter pilots that get their commercial license actually go through with it and find a job, and the rest end up having to leave the industry just because there's so little jobs out there. So I was one of those very few folks that found a company that would get it going. And what I started doing was this pipeline patrol. And my captain at the time was Brandon Dewick, who's a good friend of mine to this day. And he kind of trained me for the first couple of years doing this pipeline patrol. And then after that's when we started to get into more fires. In aviation, you work your way up, with some of those low-hanging fruit jobs, maybe the less technical jobs, and then you work your way up into more technical roles and maybe more technical helicopters there.
What is pipeline patrol? What does that entail?
At the time, I didn't even really know myself, man. I just want to fly the helicopter.
I've heard of paw patrol, but I think that's different.
Yeah, so we had an infrared camera on the bottom of the helicopter, and you follow a pipeline. I think it was for Hemna Pipelines up there, and you follow a pipeline. You're looking for any leaks, any cracks, any abnormal activity happening along the pipeline, because they had thousands of square kilometers that their pipelines run up in northern Alberta. They use aviation, they use helicopters to be kind of the eyes and ears from the sky, and then we report that back to the oil and gas company if there's anything of interest that we think they should look at. Yeah.
What would it be? Third fire department I worked for, when I first went through their orientation, and then we were given our assignments as far as a station, and he was I think he was a captain at the time, was given out the assignments, and then he goes, all right, the next station, he said, you see this map here? He said, well, if we have an incident at this station, that you guys won't even be alive anymore. So the next station will be coming to respond, because we had a pipeline going through Orange County, Orlando. And then right in that first U was also a fertilizer factory. And for a lot of people, they know that, fossil fuels and fertilizers tend to go bang if there's a if there's a spark. So I was at the station where we were right next to the pipeline, and God forbid there'd been an issue, all of the firefighters were being vaporized basically. So glad I don't work there anymore.
No kidding.
So you mentioned wildfires then. So kind of walk me through the journey to that position, and what does that even entail through a pilot's eyes?
Yeah, there's a few different avenues in forestry that you can go in as a helicopter pilot. And, for the most part, I'll just talk on helicopters rather than fixed wing, because I don't have any experience on the airplane side. But for me, how it started was that infrared camera that I told you about. The first job that I had on a fire was we'd head out to the fire. I was operating the camera. And once a fire has passed, and for the most part for the men and women on the ground and the other aviation assets, once they've somewhat got the fire almost extinguished, they'll bring this helicopter in. Our helicopter's a small one, and we grid the entire fire back and forth with this camera looking for hotspots. Anything that might potentially re-spark the fire. Once we find those hotspots, we take those coordinates, give them back. That was my first introduction to wildfires. From there, the next season, my boss, Kevin Hickling, he kind of gave me a little bit more leash, and he let me captain the helicopter out on some of these fires, and then I would have my own camera operator. And then also we would move up to the next step, which is flying around the fire bosses. So we'd pick them up in our helicopter. We'd fly the fire boss. Some days you just 8 hours of just circling the fire from a high altitude bird dogging. And that fire boss that's in the helicopter sitting beside me, he or she is giving the direction to all the other aviation assets that are down there actually on the fire suppression, the ones that are dumping the water. And then also the crews on the ground giving direction there. I did that for about 2 years. And then the next step up was when I get into the A star was initial attack. And that's where things kind of get a little bit more fun, in the field, because now you're actually doing the fire suppression. So I would go up north, from May to October every year, and you get a helicopter and you kind of say goodbye to management, and you get shipped out somewhere in Canada to go and chase the fires. And, it's usually yourself, an engineer and 3 or 4 firefighters on this initial attack, and we'll get staged anywhere. I was primarily based in Alberta up in Slave Lake, so we travel around Alberta and we get stationed out somewhere on the boonies for the day. We'd fly out there, that'd be our staging point, and on initial attack, you're just waiting for the call. So they have all these different helicopter assets around Alberta, and most provinces do a similar process. And as soon as a lightning strike might happen, as soon as someone reports a fire, you get the call and you're the first one on the fire. You'll get to the fire, you'll do a few laps. The firefighters will take its measurements and specifics there and relay them back to base. And then we'll drop off the boys as close as we can get to the fire. Sometimes they have pretty long hikes, or maybe you'll do a hover exit, get them a little bit closer. They'll hit the fire from the ground. And then at that point, I'll throw the belly bucket on and the long line on, and then I'll fight it from the air with constant radio communication from air to ground, letting me know where they want me to hit the fire exactly until we extinguish it. Or in a lot of cases, and I found it got worse and worse every year, summers got hotter, we've got to call in more assets, so more helicopters, or call in the air tankers there if the fire does take off and we can't get it under control.
We've seen some pretty funny videos over the last few years, of where some of these helicopters are getting their water source from. People on the California mountains where their pool is suddenly plunged. Where are some of the most unusual places you found water?
Yeah, no, there are some good videos. I remember this one time I was in the 212 and we got dispatched to a fire right beside these folks' house, and they had a big kind of tailoring pond. This looked like a man-made lake right beside the house, and the fire was right beside it. So I was like, perfect. I'm just gonna. You don't even have to do a circuit. I can just go pick up, drop, pick up, drop. Well, at the time when you're fighting fire, you could be, miles. You might be 10 minutes, 15 minutes from your closest water source. But I had it right there, so I went in and started just dumping water in the fire out of this pond, and then all the fire trucks and police finally showed up there, and then this one dude underneath my helicopter just comes out there. I could see him waving my hands at me from down below, and he's grabbing his hair, pulling his eyeballs out. It looked like freaking out, and I didn't know what was going on. I just kept on going about my business. And and then finally dispatch called me on the radio. They said, "Hey, Owen, you got to stop pulling out of that pond." So what are you talking about? I said, their house is about to light on fire. The guy just apparently spent $1 million filling it with trout, that pond there. And that's his main fishing resource that you're pulling it out of. And then the firefighters said they had hundreds of trout all over the fire on the bottom. So I think I obviously had to go and look for a different spot there.
But they ate well that night, though.
Yeah, they ate well that night. Yeah, but otherwise, I don't have any really fascinating spots. Sometimes when you're pulling out of a fast flowing river, that can be a little bit challenging because you'll find yourself, as soon as you put the bucket in to fill it up, the river's going to pull the bucket down, so you can feel it. It pulls the helicopter, so you kind of got to time it. So you got to follow the river's flow a little bit with your bucket to pull it up. And the fast moving rivers can be a little bit more challenging. But on the other side, in Alberta, there's a lot of marshes, so you can't really get your bucket in full. You might only get a couple feet, and that's when the bucket usually gets ripped on a stick or something like that. Pulling it up can be a little more challenging. But the most fun spots is when you don't have a water source at all. They'll put in these pumpkins, these big fabric pools, and they'll fill up these pools with water from one of those lower streams, and then you got to put the bucket into these big pools and pick it up and go. And I've never been a great precision long liner, but that was always fun because you got to be very specific where you're dropping the bucket into.
I remember hearing a story, and I don't know if it's an urban legend or if it's actually true, that the body of a scuba diver was found at a wildfire once, and then they figured out supposedly that he was in a body of water when it was scooped by an aircraft and then dropped on the fire. But I don't know if that ended up just being an urban legend. Is this something that you've heard of?
I have heard that story too, James. Again, I don't know if there's truth, but I remember hearing that as well. Yeah, that someone got scooped up by one of the tankers potentially.
Yeah, that'd be a shitty way to go.
Yeah, that's not how I want to go out.
No.
No.
Well, you talked about, the higher frequency of needing more resources. In this time that you've been doing this position, what has been your observation of the frequency and intensity of these wildfires? Because a lot of people in the wildland community seem to say, no, this global warming thing, it's a thing because the fires are getting more and more and more, and the seasons are getting longer and longer and longer.
Yeah. I definitely saw that. I fought fires for about 10 years total. And it seemed like as I throughout the years, I feel like every couple of years you have a pretty blazing fire season where you just feel defeated and that you didn't do anything. You didn't put out, you didn't extinguish anything. For the most part, I find fighting fires, when you have those heavy fire seasons, helicopters, guys and girls on the ground, we're not putting out the fires. The only thing that's putting out the fires is Mother Nature when the fall comes, when the rain comes. And that started happening a lot, as I was fighting fires and feeling that way. We get out to, a couple 100,000 hectare fire, and you look at it and you're just like, where do you start? It takes you 30 minutes to fly the length of the fire, and it's blazing, and here I am carrying 270 gallons of water on a time before the water hits the ground, it's evaporated. And I think, for us helicopters, we don't have the same capacity as some of the large tankers, but our main job is just to increase the humidity around a fire so it just doesn't spread as quickly. When it gets that size of fire, we're not putting it out. It's not going to happen, but maybe we can increase the humidity around it so it just doesn't grow as quickly, or maybe we can try and save some assets, some structures that are around it as well. But I remember my last few years of fighting fires, you just kind of start thinking, like, why are we here? The province is spending millions a day on this fire alone, with all the assets hitting it, and it's only doubling in size each day. And that's, sometimes that's a tough realization.
One of the things that I hear a lot of the wildland community say is also the opposition to prescribed burns, because of the smoke in the town or the city or whatever it is. But then you think, well, what is the impact on the air quality when you have a raging fire? I mean, surely it's better to do that. And then the other thing from there, safety is, some of the permits that people have been allowed to build in these places are so remote that are now, taking all these resources to save this one family because they're, in this certain area that maybe should be just deemed as, wildland only. So, it sounds like they're like, same with mine in the municipal side, there are a lot of answers to these problems. Even with the Jason Ramos talking about the shelters, our community were kind of led to believe that if there's a burnover, the shelter will save you. But you look at the science, it's not most likely. And now that becomes kind of like they talk about with our gear. The better the quality of gear, the deeper into the fire we could go, to the more dangerous it is. It's the same with the shelters. If you believe that a shelter is going to save you, you're going to put human beings in an area that maybe they shouldn't have been there in the first place. So when you listen to the voices of that community, they're all saying the same thing, like, allow aggressive prescribed burns to address the fuel in the first place. Make sure people aren't building where they just it's going to be so dangerous for them, and then protecting the urban interface, clearing the brush on the edge of where the houses are. I mean, that preventative side would be a lot more effective than this kind of reactive, we got a fire, now we're going to drop humans in with shovels and picks and and hope to God that they can dig their way out of this 100,000 acre monster.
100%, James. Like you kind of nailed it there, man. And like it's a lot to do that preventative side, but you see it in a lot of communities that are fire zones where the community, they'll brush down any brush for the whole perimeter of the community. So at least you have this fire guard for when a fire does start or a brush fire does start, that it's not getting right into the community. And, Slave Lake, where I was working, for the start of my career, my 20s, half that town burnt down in a fire. So, it's a pretty sensitive subject for them, and they're doing a lot of prevention. But every single year, it seems like there's some new sort of pressure on another community that's either getting burnt down or partly burnt down there. But, these fires are massive, and there's so many of them. Like, in one province alone, you might have a few hundred fires, either under control to out of control, burning in a single season. And I find each province fights fires a little bit differently here in Canada. In BC and Alberta, we tend to hit and throw a lot of resources for any fire that's out there. Sometimes I wonder if it's a little bit political, and the public, if the province isn't seen doing something about it, they get a lot of backlash. But when you go up to the Northwest Territories or Ontario, they tend to, if a fire starts off, unless there's no structures or there's no pressure towards a community, they just let it burn. And I kind of feel like that's a better model. When a fire will burn, the amount of carbon that comes out of it, there's a lot of great growth that will happen from that fire afterwards, initially. So, I think, it depends on the communities, depends on the province, how they elect to fight the fires. But everyone's a little bit different, I notice, province to province, from east to west of Canada.
Have you ever heard anyone discuss how the First Nation people used to deal with wildland fires before, this kind of Western development?
No, not really, James. But, I would say, the majority of our firefighters, when I was out in Alberta, are Indigenous populations that are going out there. They've been fighting fires longer than any of us have. And they have the best idea to it, and that's why they're still out there today doing it. But no, I'm not too sure, how they might have done it differently in the past. Aviation obviously is now a huge part of fighting fires. A lot of the time when you move up onto a certain category of helicopter, most, the first couple hours of your morning is just moving firefighters out to the fire from the camp, and then you throw in the bucket and you go and rip a few buckets throughout the day on the fire, and then you bring them back at the end of the night. Where otherwise, now that we can get to fires a lot quicker, is that why we're fighting them now rather than just letting them burn? But those are things I'm not too sure on.
Yeah, no, interesting.
Yeah.
What about the EMS side then? When did you start flying those?
I started flying those when I was 21 years old. I started flying EMS. Again, I was always really attracted to more of the social and community-based work. I kind of lit a little fire, no pun intended there, right in my butt. So I got into that, did that for about 2-3 years, the EMS. Really enjoyed it. I love doing that type of work, flying around British Columbia and the hills. And got to see all these same communities that now Helicopters Without Borders is servicing. But, I used to see them on more of a emergent high acute patient transport realm. And then after I did that for a couple of years, and then I just missed the bush too much. So I went back to the bush, back to my old company, Remote Helicopters, and went fighting fires for another few years after that. And then came back to EMS again. So I kind of bounced back and forth throughout my 20s there before starting Helicopters Without Borders.
A lot of people that have talked to me about Indigenous populations, some here in the US, in Canada, this is obviously not all, but it doesn't seem like people are aware of a lot of the struggles of some of these places, reservations, etc. And, when you think about the conversation that we have in our professions as far as that identity and that tribe, whether it's you're a firefighter or a pilot or, a paramedic, I can't imagine actually being part of a tribe, the original use of the word, and then having that systematically deconstructed to the point where you're kind of Europeanized and your tribe is kind of, your identity is almost taken away completely. And the ripple effect that would have on alcoholism and domestic violence and, the unaddressed trauma that we all know is that domino effect. But a lot of people say, there is a lot of struggles in some of these Indigenous populations. What were you seeing in these communities that you were serving?
Yeah, thanks, James. Well, when I was on a fire, again, until I started fighting fires, didn't start to realize some of the challenges that are happening right in our backyard. And I think the U.S. is going to be very similar too. But, I remember getting out to a fire in Northern Ontario into a flying community. Just getting there, and, I spent a month there staying at this lady's house, showed up, and kind of like I was just really taken back at what was going on. The amount of poverty right in our backyard here in Canada, which is a pretty developed country, but it felt like you were in an underdeveloped country right in our backyard. Those stories and those images are something that I hadn't been shared with before. I didn't know what was going on. But a lot of the struggles, it depends community to community. When I was fighting fires in Alberta and Ontario, addiction, a lot of individuals living in that type of isolation, little services there, will turn to substance, And that was, I think, pretty prevalent, for a lot of the locations I went to, drugs and alcohol. I think that tends to be, again, I'm not speaking for them, I can't, but from my eyes, that tends to be the number one challenge. And then from that, there's a trickle down effect of other type of barriers that come with living in that type of isolation.
What were some of the memorable calls you ran while you were still in the EMS side?
I think, it was my first year. I think the burn victims were always probably the most challenging ones. There was a young lady that actually lit herself on fire, and I remember picking her up, and I think she had like 100% burn, or it might have even been above that. So we knew that she was going to pass at some point within the next few hours, but the burn facility is in Vancouver. So we flew up to pick her up, and yeah, that was that image there was tough, because the individual no longer has a face or limbs, it's just what looked like charcoal at that point. So that one kind of always stuck with me, especially the smell in the helicopter too, the challenging one. I remember, I think it was always too the vulnerable folks, the young and the elder. There were challenging calls to go to. I remember picking up this young girl, and her and her family were driving from Prince Rupert, which is the west coast of BC, over to Terrace, and we got dispatched to a call on the highway. A car had run off the side of the highway into the river, and we got there, and we were the first ones on scene, which is actually quite rare for the air ambulance. Usually there's always some sort of first responder already before you who's making the call. I don't know what happened, but we got there before the ambulances, before police showed up to the site, and there was no car. You couldn't even see it in the river. So you can kind of only assume what's going on or how long that car has been in the river for. But as soon as the divers got there, they went down, and everyone was still in the car. And the only person that they could pull out was the young girl. She was about 5 years old. And, so they pull out this young girl, and she was already passed. But, we paramedics tried to revive her, and we put her in the helicopter and try and get her to the hospital. We only have one stretcher in the helicopter, so you kind of got pick and choose. And it was going to be the young girl that we were going to fly to the hospital there. So those ones there, those ones are always challenging. I think the young and the elder I found for sure.
With your perspective, I've spoken to this from the kind of flight medic point of view as well. But as the pilot, my first fire department, I remember Hialeah, they were big on us creating LZs, and we did quite a lot of training actually on helping the helicopter land. What can the crews on the ground do to set you up for success on a scene like that?
Yeah, great question, James. The crews in BC here, because I've only flown air ambulance in BC, They're fantastic. They're pretty dialed in, the firefighters. They go, some of our managers will go and do training with the fire departments of how to set up the LZ. Um, Honestly, there's nothing that I think they could do better. They already do such a great job of securing the area. Like just this last summer, there was a boating accident over in North Van, and we got a call to a tight little spot in a park. So, we had hundreds of people circled around us, filming us there. And that's really hard for the first responders in a park to secure that area for the helicopter to land. But, they had their whole perimeter secured with fire trucks and police vehicles to make sure no one's walking around. But a lot of the time, there's only so much they can do because some of the sites that we land at, it's really dependent on the drivers, on the pilots, if we're going to be able to squeeze in there or not. And at the same time, they do a good job, but they obviously are not in aviation, a lot of them themselves. So it's hard for them to know what the decision is going to be of the pilot. Every pilot is different, what their comfort level is when you're landing there. And they got to try and match that standard. So it's not an easy task that they have setting up the LZs.
And talk to me about the challenges when it comes to weather as well, because there's a lot of times. Obviously, you have a call, you hope there's going to be some sort of helicopter that's going to be able to transport the patient. But especially in Florida here, we have a lot of intense weather. We have high winds. We have thunder, lightning, etc. What are the safety parameters when you can, and then what are the restrictions that maybe people don't even realize?
Yeah. Well, for weather, for sure, that's where most of the cancellations, the majority of them are going to come from, is the weather. So one of the restrictions that, ECHS, the dispatchers will do, is that they don't share any of the information on the type of call, who the call is for, the condition of the patient. They don't relay that to us because they don't want that to influence our decision on safety, on the weather. So we just get a call. We know roughly maybe the coordinates of where we're going, or if it's a hospital transfer, we know the hospital. We go in and check the weather. Daytime, in the daytime, it's a lot easier to get around. You can see, and we're VFR most of the time. But as soon as you get into night ops, that's where it gets a little bit more challenging, and our margins go way up at night ops there for obvious reasons. You just can't see naturally. But I would say, to answer your question, what are some things that people don't realize is that, those first responders, they get a lot of flack for when they don't go, or they do have to cancel a call because of weather, saying, maybe the pilots aren't trying hard enough. We had to wait 6 hours. We're restricted by law. Like we have minimums that Transport Canada, and for you guys down there, that FAA sets for pilots. And this is the limit that you have. You must have this much visibility. Your clouds must be this high. If they're not, you cannot go. So we have to follow those. And a lot of the time when we can't, we're civilian aircraft is how the ambulance program works here in Canada, but who can have further or lower margins is the military. And for us up in Canada, the search and rescue is operated by the military. So they'll get sent out in circumstances maybe where we can't, or a patient is extremely critical where they need to send that type of helicopter. Yeah.
Well, speaking of that, Dave was on the show and talked about some of the most hairy flights that he's had. What are some of your biggest pucker factor moments that you've had in the helicopter itself?
Yeah, Dave's an absolute legend, man. His aviation career spans far and wide past mine in those stories. For me, it would have to be weather for the most part. Can scare you, but I remember when I was flying, I think I had like 120 hours, so I was fresh out of school, and I was on my second job alone, and I was in a Jet Ranger in northern Alberta, and I was taking some operators into a some sort of research station. I can't remember, but I turned the helicopter, and I was downwind at the time, and I turned the helicopter for my final approach. I just didn't have enough airspeed, man. And I just didn't know the helicopter well enough. And I made my turn, and I made that turn to go into final. I just started to fall the sky because I didn't keep enough airspeed. You naturally will start to lose airspeed as you make a sharp turn like that. And I remember the helicopter just started dropping, and I was already low. And I was like, oh shit, man, what am I going to do? And the only thing you could do is just nose the helicopter's nose down to try and pick up airspeed so that you can pick up more lift. And that's what I did, but I was already so low, and I came right into the tree line. Luckily, there was a small little road in this tree line, so I was able to go into it down below the tree line and get some airspeed and come up. And I just remember my passengers, I was like, oh, that was so cool. That was great, man. In the back of my mind, I was like, oh, you don't understand what's going on in my pants right now, buddy. But yeah, that was great. Let's go along with that. Yeah. But it was, for me, my best learning experiences have unfortunately been the ones where I've almost had near misses in aviation. Most of them were when I was younger learning there. Now I know whenever I make a turn, I'm keeping airspeed. I'm not letting that airspeed drop off. Yeah.
Talk to me about sleep. Dave and I have had lots and lots of conversations. He's more than familiar with my, dead horse that I keep flogging on sleep deprivation in the fire service. But what is the oversight as far as the amount of rest and recovery you have to get as a pilot?
Yeah, I remember because Dave's done a bit of my training in the past, and he does a great session on sleep and fatigue there. So for us, the rules recently for Transport Canada has changed of how much time off. And I think it used to be we had to have 8 hours off shift. And I think now we're closer to that 12-hour mark, depending on what type of ops or what type of flying you're doing and which regs you fall under. But when you're flying their ambulance, you might do a few night shifts, a few day shifts in a row, very similar to how a firefighter shift work. And when you going on to night shifts off day shifts, you're still transitioning your body. So maybe you didn't sleep that day, and now you're going on to a night shift. You don't have any calls, and then a call comes in, around 1 a.m. And all of a sudden, you get a call, okay, you're going up the coast here. And, from the time of just being out cold and, 20 minutes, now you're up in the air, pushing dials, flying this helicopter. You're at a very critical point of that flight when you're probably at the highest risk waking up there. You're still down, you're not aware there. And then also if you're flying all night, coming off day shifts into a night shift, you're flying all night, and you're getting back to base at 6, 7 in the morning, you haven't slept at all. You can only imagine how increased the risk is of that flight now.
I know this might be part of it, what we just discussed, but when you reflect on all the tragedies in your industry, are there any common denominators behind these crashes?
That's a good question. You can read the TSB reports there on what happens, but unfortunately, it seems like a lot of the pointing goes back to pilot error, pilot decision making. I think a lot of flights and a lot of tragedies that happen usually end up men and women pushing weather. That's usually what happens when they're pushing weather, and they get themselves in an unknown point where they should have turned back a bit ago, but they didn't, and now there is nowhere to turn back to. So that happens a lot. So yeah, I think it probably would have to be weather there, James. Obviously mechanical does happen a fair bit with the helicopters, the new helicopters. Actually, for the most part, when I was flying the 212, that's an old helicopter. It's very reliable though. But all the troubles that I got in, it was mainly the troubles I put myself in on the helicopter.
It reminds me, I had one of my friends on Dukes who's a skydiver and a base jumper. And he was talking about, there's times where they climb, for hours to get to the top of this peak. And, he said something doesn't feel right, and you gotta trust your gut. He said, but it takes a lot of courage to turn around and say, no, we're going to walk back down again. We're not doing the jump. And I think it's kind of, what you're talking about too. Like that's the ultimate self-discipline, is to be able to say now isn't the right time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, James. I remember the stuff that I used to do, in my early 20s when I was just starting pilot, the amount of risks that I'd take for no reason. And I don't know why in the past, maybe you're trying to prove something to someone, you're trying to build up your hours, you're trying to get the job complete for the client. There's always a lot of pressure from clients who are hiring you. But now, as I've kind of had a little bit, I've been flying for 15 years now, you just don't, those risks aren't worth it anymore. The holes that I used to land in, you might be 5 feet away from your blade tip. You don't need to do that anymore. It's not worth it. So you don't bother doing it, man. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, you've talked about, obviously up to this point, working for agencies. What was it that you started seeing that made you want to create your own nonprofit to help people in these communities?
Well, I would have to, even before working with the communities that we work with now, my uncle Paul, he's a dude that you should have on your podcast. He worked for over 40 years in the humanitarian business. When he was young, 20s, he moved over to Africa, where he never came back, and he fell in love with the humanitarian world, working for World Vision, high up in executive levels, and Care USA as well. So he'd always been an inspiration of mine. And then I told you earlier, I had my father as an inspiration. So I wanted to get into what my Uncle Paul was doing, but I loved aviation. I was trying to figure out, okay, do I maybe go out and change industries for a little bit? I tried to get on with the UN for a number of years, flying for the World Food Program. I got offered 2 contracts year after year. But at the same time, I'd already built relationships and promised my commitment to the fighting fire to another company in Canada. So I turned those down. And after that happened, I just had such an itch because I really wanted to go and fly for the World Food Program that I decided, okay, well, maybe just try and start my own nonprofit, not doing anything to the degree that the UN's doing. But it was kind of a way to marry, my mentor, my dad, my mentor, my Uncle Paul, of the 2 things that they were doing. And that's kind of where Helicopters Without Borders started to grow and started to build a little bit of a business plan. And when I say a business plan, maybe 3 pages of chicken scratch of things that we could possibly do. And so that was kind of the beginning days of it. And when we actually decided to launch Helicopters Without Borders, we knew that we wanted to work here in Canada, and I always say when people hear that Helicopters Without Borders, you think of international NGO, and that's what I think a lot of people think we are. But, we're born and bred right here in British Columbia, and our projects are in our backyard, looking for ways that we can honor Indigenous in our backyard, but not just Indigenous, also people that are just living in isolation, people that don't have the same services and care that I have the luxury of living here in the Lower Mainland, British Columbia.
So firstly, what is the need that you were seeing? What is missing? What are the deficits in these communities?
Every community is different. Each community seems like they have different interests, different needs, and different ways that they'd like to partner up with Helicopters Without Borders. But I think, in British Columbia, one of five people live in rural parts. BC is huge, Canada is huge. So there's a lot of individuals far from health centers in the province. And a lot of communities don't have road access into them. They're either only accessible by air or by boat. So when most people think about helicopters, they think of helicopters in the healthcare setting as a last resort. So an air ambulance responding when something has already gone wrong. We, Helicopters Without Borders, we're trying to shift that model. So we're not so much into that that high acute, that emergency response. But instead of using aviation for emergencies only here in BC now, we're using it to reach communities before the crisis happens. And we do that in a few different modalities. One is preventative care, education, and health awareness, bringing that directly to remote communities, underserved communities, marginalized communities. We're trying to address the root cause. And we believe that's where real change is going to happen. So this approach that we're working on, it moves the healthcare upstream. In the long term, we hope it's going to reduce avoidable hospitalizations. It's going to lower the long-term system costs that we have right now, and hopefully in turn improve quality of life. So rather than waiting for someone to become critically ill and flying them out, James, we're flying care in. And that's just one little way that we're trying to build healthier communities from the ground up here in BC. But back to your question, I know that was a little bit long-winded. For us, preventative care is what we're trying to do, and we have to explain to the communities. A lot of them do want emergency care. They want a better air ambulance system, but we're not in that game. So if they want to partner with us on more of the low-hanging fruits, the preventative side, that's for the communities. Those are the communities that we partner up with. Yeah.
So what does the preventative side look like? Are you flying physicians there to do clinics, or what do you see on the ground itself?
Yeah, so how the actual ops works, depending on what type of services that a community has requested from us. We'll usually leave on a Monday, beginning of the week. I got back last night from a new community that we're partnered up with. We'll leave usually beginning of the week, and we'll be there for 4 or 5 days. And we'll bring, for this trip, we brought up our mobile dental clinics. So these are clinics, they don't have dental infrastructure. They'll load up in the back of the helicopter, from the x-ray to the compressor units, to the patient chairs. They'll go up in the community, and we'll set them up. We'll have a full-fledged dental clinic up there within an hour. But we do fly physicians like family doctors a bit, not too much, because a lot of MSP, our insurance, covers that already. So for some of the communities, they're already having that. And we're trying to step in where there are other services maybe are not. So that could be mental health. That could be, we do a lot of chronic health disease, so diabetes, scanning dietitians going into communities. We do pediatrics, occupational therapy, physiotherapy there. We kind of trying to build up that list and slowly gain into kidney checks as well. Yeah, so there's a few on the list, but again, each community has a different request and a little bit different.
And how are you funding this?
Well, I need to get on more of these podcasts, hopefully, so we can do that. But right now, James, it's mainly funded through private donors. We have big funders out of Toronto that have a very specific interest in remote healthcare. So we get pockets of funds from them. We do a lot of grant writing as well, our grant writing team. We have a donor who donates all of our jet fuel and our carbon offsets as well, Petro Value Products. They've been a fantastic partner of ours from day one. And other than that, I think a lot of the fundraising comes from relationships, people that are board of directors who might introduce us to, but where we find the most success is from our previous donors who love what we do. They introduce us to more of their networks as well. Yeah, so privately, and we don't take too much public funds. That could be changing here this year from the government, but when you take government funding, it comes with a lot of red tape and a lot of reporting. And we're a team of about 10 individuals, and already as a startup, we're all running around with our heads cut off. And then to add a bunch of reporting that goes on to that, it can be challenging sometimes. But hopefully we're going to build ourselves up our capacity so that we can start to look at more government funding. But on the other side, when you start to take the government funding too, naturally, and it's fair enough, they're going to want a little bit of say in which direction we're going. But what we find with the private donors, they give us a lot of leash to let us do the good work, and they're going to fund it.
If you had access to all the resources that you needed, what would the kind of, I know it's going to be dynamic, what would the ultimate end product look like?
I think we want to get more into these team-based care flights. So a team of practitioners who are working directly with a community to build a care plan for that community, and the two build it together. And, that could be a team of chronic health specialists. Let's just focus in on diabetes, so you can have someone from the kidney check team to the nurses doing the testing, but working together to build this plan. And then Helicopters Without Borders is flying this team in to these communities on a more regular basis. Right now, we only have funding to do about 4 trips a year to each community that we serve. We're serving right now, working with about 10 communities, so almost every single week. But if we could build up this team-based care model to go out into the communities on a more regular basis, maybe once a month, so that they can have these services, I think that would be the end game. And on a geographical side, James is expanding this across Canada. BC, we have a lot of isolated communities, but when you go up to the north and you go further east, there's the same amount, and it's happening. There's a lot of these flying communities, a lot of communities with only winter roads going into them. And we believe that, carbon neutral aviation is a great tool in the toolkit to do that. When we look at somewhere like Australia, John Flynn, this fellow almost about 100 years ago now, he developed a charity to service the most isolated parts of Australia by air called Royal Flying Doctors, who maybe you've heard of. Today, Royal Flying Doctors is the world's largest air medical program. They got close to 100 helicopters, and they do preventative care, they do primary care, they do education. They're a great mentor to look up to. I think our model is a little bit different than theirs, but Australia, when you look at geographics, very similar to Canada as well. And I think that's a great place that Canada could look up to, of where aviation maybe could play a role in healthcare here a little bit more.
From the prevention point of view, when you talk about healthcare or health here in America, we are literally 3/4 obese or overweight, our nation. So there is so much room for improvement to make the nation healthier, and therefore take a huge chunk out of what we spend on healthcare and put it into all the proactive measures. What are some of the common denominators that you're seeing in some of these communities that you serve, that if that was addressed, you would have a healthier population, and therefore maybe not such a need to have consistent medical visits?
Yeah, and James, you mean specifically like on food and diet is what you're talking about?
Yeah, food, diet, community, addiction support, the elements that would put them back. I mean, we were talking about the Indigenous people earlier. These were tribes that didn't need healthcare and, glucometers and insulin, and, they were moving well, they were eating well, they had community. So not saying we go back to maybe that level, but we have God, my brain is not working today. As a generation, we've strayed so far from the ancient wisdom that literally carried, humans for millennia up to this point. So we're kind of tapping back into that so that we're forging health again, and therefore not having to lean so heavily on the health side.
Yeah. In Indigenous communities, they've been leading solutions for a lot longer than we've been here. But today that the community governed services that they practice, and culturally grounded care, and models where people aren't forced to choose between safety and access. But it's a really tough subject, and one I wish I had more experience and knowledge in. But when I look at it from an outsider, constantly learning, about reconciliation and the effects of colonization. But, a lot of the First Nations here, they used to live off the lands. They did a lot better than we know how to do it. And then they were colonized, and they were told to turn into white people and follow our rules and follow our standards. And then, there became a certain point where Canada, they said, okay, well, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. And they closed the residential schools and said, you can go back to your traditional ways, but unfortunately, a lot of those traditional ways were now lost and they were forgotten. So a lot of the communities that we partner up with and have the luxury of going to are kind of caught in that limbo of, okay, well, this is what we used to do, and this is what we've been now taught for the last couple hundred years. And that's where the issues arise, because now they're left to fend for themselves. And when we talk about even, languages, we were just in the community yesterday, and it's been a long time since I've heard an elder speak their traditional language. And it was so refreshing these last 2 days where we were to hear two of the elders communicating in their traditional language. And a lot of the communities are trying to reteach that to their youth, but even now their elders, getting to a point where there's not many that still speak it. So those languages are getting lost.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. It really is. I mean, there's an element, of course, of what's happened has happened, and we have to, acknowledge that too. You can't go back in time and undo all the damage, but at the same time, how do we learn from history? How do we try and put things back that were broken, that that are able to be fixed again? And how do we then take the wisdom from yesteryear and apply it with some of the great technology of today and have a fusion? But there's a lot of arrogance in modern society, full stop. And look at the CBD and chiropractic and plant medicine. We're finally going, oh, this seems to work, and then we're asking for 1,000 studies rather than going, well, this literally lasted for thousands of years. So clearly there's something to it. Do we need to have, double-blind studies to see if psilocybin is helpful for mental health? No, we know it is, because it's worked for centuries and centuries. So yeah, I think, dropping our egos, being humble enough to know where our ancestors screwed up, because it wasn't on the generation that's here right now, mostly, but then finding that blend between, trying to put back as much as we can, but then also, not stay in the past and move forward with this new kind of, fusion, like I said. But if we just pretend that all the bad stuff didn't happen, then that certainly doesn't make things better. But then we also can't, we can't undo what's done. There are cities all over Native American land now, so we've got to find that middle ground somehow.
Yeah, 100%, James. And, a lot of the communities, living in locations there, some of the coolest stuff to see is the resilience that they have and the attitude that, they're still fighting there. In a lot of the communities, they are doing well. I mean, it's not all, Helicopters Without Borders. We're a charity, obviously. So, sometimes trying to fix problems, but there's a lot of bright things happening in the communities that we work with too. And a lot of learnings that Helicopters Without Borders is taking of how we behave and how we move around the province there for our next step.
Beautiful. Well, I want to throw some closing questions at you before I let you go.
Yes.
The first one I love to ask, is there a book or are there books that you love to recommend? It can be related to our discussion today or completely unrelated.
Yeah. I wish I read more, James, but, one book, The Untethered Soul, was a book that I read, maybe about 10 years ago. And it was kind of a game changer for me. Just how I think about life and go about life as an individual, and think about the individuals around me. So I would say that would be my book that I would recommend if anyone hasn't read that one, The Untethered Soul. Yeah.
Beautiful. What about television, documentaries, or films?
Well, I was just joking with my partner Maya this morning. Maya's a resident doctor, and she was just telling me, the last thing she wants to do when she comes home is, think anything about medical, anything about doctor, or watch any show. But what I did yesterday when I got back home from my flight, I crashed on the couch and put on an episode of Mayday. And that's my favorite show to watch, on air disasters and true air disasters. And she goes, "You're weird, man." So, I've always liked Mayday. I like watching that. I think it's relevant for me in aviation. They look at what's happened in the air, true stories, what went wrong, and how can you correct it, and how you can be safer next time.
Has she ever watched The Pit, that new show?
James, it's so funny you say that, because someone told me about that show when I was up in community, and that's what brought up the conversation. I asked her, I said, "Have you ever seen The Pit?" And she said, "I'm not watching any shows after I come home." So we said we watched together, but maybe not when she's on ER shifts, she said.
Yeah, it's good because it really does a great job of showing a lot of issues in medicine. It shows, everything from how busy ERs actually are. This whole COVID thing when they were screaming about people being in the hallways, and we're like, yeah, they're always in the hallways. Have you never been to an ER? They're a nightmare. But the violence against nurses, and then just really, really well done, but also technically, like they have got such good technical advisors that all the procedures, all the drugs, the defibrillation, all that stuff is right. So as someone in medicine, when you're watching it, you're like, oh, okay, good. This is actually what it looks like. And of course, there's a slight, Hollywood twist to it, but nothing like, what you normally see. So yeah, if she, ever feels like watching something and maybe is on a break, it is actually worth a watch.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, she's been in the ER just on her first few months here on the shifts, and Maya's a special human being, and she likes it, but I think she's missing the interaction with the people. She feels like you're a bit of a machine and a puppy mill, just getting people in, and you got to push them out because those ERs are so busy. But it's not really how Maya operates. She wants to be with the individuals, working with them directly.
Yeah, that's understandable. Well, the next question, is there a person that you recommend to come on this podcast as a guest to speak to the first responders, military, and associated professions of the world?
I think a good one would be our other co-founder. My father's a co-founder of Helicopters Without Borders, but the other one is Adam Oldos. He's a veteran as well. Adam lives down in, he just moved from Texas up the east. I can't remember what state he's in now, but he was a brain and a heart behind this project of Helicopters Without Borders. But he just served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, I believe. In the past, he's a helicopter pilot as well. Now he runs his own night flight concepts, training those type of individuals how to operate at nighttime in aviation with MPG. So I would recommend Adam for sure. Yeah,
I'd love to. If you're able to help me connect, I think it would be great to get him on.
Connect you. Yeah, for sure, Jay. I'll connect you right after this.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, then the last question before we make sure everyone knows where to find Helicopters Without Borders and you, what do you do to decompress?
My partner, Maya, she's over in Denmark. We've been doing long distance for about 4 years now. It's hard for us to connect with 9-hour time difference. But one thing that she's gotten me a little bit better at over the last few years, James, is just talking about some of the issues and challenges and the great things that are happening at work that maybe I didn't do enough of. And now practicing that a little bit more and having someone to just be a sounding board has been, it's been huge. It's been great, and I really appreciate her for opening up that door for me. So I guess in short, just talking to someone rather than letting it build up in your head, those stories and their thoughts. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, for people listening then, firstly, where can they find Helicopters Without Borders if they want to support in some way?
Yeah, our website's a great place, helicopterswithoutborders.org. On Instagram, but at the same time, we're still a small organization. You'll see the email up on our website. Shoot us an email. That's forwarded directly to my email, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, share a little bit about what we're doing, and set up a call. So I think those are the best modes of communication for us.
Beautiful. And are there any areas on social media they can find you?
Yeah, I think we're Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn are our channels right now. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, I want to thank Dave again for making this connection. And I want to thank you. It's been such an interesting perspective. I mean, you having, firstly this father that was in this industry, and then the fire side and the EMS side, and then you finding the altruism that you saw in your father and your uncle, and then creating this amazing organization. It's been a phenomenal conversation. So I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Yeah, thank you, James. Thanks for everything you do and your past too, man. It was a pleasure to meet you, and I look forward to the next one if it happens in the near future.